I used to believe the strangest thing I would ever fix was a reactor coolant valve the size of a pickup truck. But the day an alien princess called me her consort proved I had seriously underestimated the universe. The memory still begins with the smell of hot metal and machine oil drifting through Bay 12 of the rusting orbital junk station where I worked, a place where gravity hummed at a comfortable 0.8 g, and every tool had a layer of dust older than most colonies. My name is Ethan Carter, and 3 days before everything changed, I was exactly what I looked like, a human mechanic with grease on his hands, a torque wrench clipped to my belt, and a life measured in repair invoices and foot-pounds of pressure. The station floated 200 miles above a desert moon that nobody bothered naming, and most days the loudest sound was the slow groan of cargo doors and the occasional thud of a landing shuttle bringing in scrap. I was crouched beside a battered mining exoframe, adjusting a misaligned servo joint that kept slipping under load, when the hangar lights suddenly dimmed and the air vibrated with the low, controlled thunder of engines far more advanced than anything that usually docked there. At first I figured it was just another corporate courier, but the ship that descended through the docking bay doors was something else entirely, a sleek vessel with a hull that shimmered like polished glass under the work lights, easily 300 feet long and elegant in a way machines rarely were. The entire hangar went quiet. Even the station drones paused mid-route like they were trying to understand what they were seeing. A ramp unfolded with mechanical grace, and a line of tall armored figures stepped down, their armor reflecting the lights in soft metallic blues and silvers that made my human work gear look like something out of a garage sale. Then she appeared. The alien princess moved with calm authority, nearly 8 feet tall, her skin a luminous sapphire tone that caught the light like the surface of deep water, her eyes bright gold and steady as if she had spent her life being watched and had long ago stopped caring. The royal armor she wore was clearly advanced, layered plates connected by smooth servo joints, and a glowing energy lattice running along the spine, but something about the way it moved told me instantly what the engineers around her either hadn't noticed or were too polite to mention. The synchronization was off. The suit responded a half-second too slow, the way a machine does when the control architecture fights itself. She walked past half a dozen silent technicians and stopped directly in front of the exoframe I had been fixing, studying the way I worked with the quiet curiosity of someone observing a completely different species. One of the armored guards spoke sharply in a language my translator struggled to catch, the tone clearly skeptical, but the princess raised a single hand, and the entire group fell silent. Her gaze shifted from the broken mining rig to the torque wrench in my hand, then back to my face as if she had just solved a puzzle no one else even realized existed. "Human," she said in clear, calm English that echoed softly through the hangar. "I am told you repair machines." I wiped the grease from my fingers and glanced at the royal armor again, noticing the misaligned servo pattern that every other engineer had apparently missed. "Yeah," I said carefully, leaning back on my heels. "And I'm pretty sure your suit was built wrong." The hangar froze. Every guard stiffened. Every technician stopped breathing. And for a long second the only sound in the bay was the steady hum of station gravity. The princess simply smiled like someone who had been waiting a very long time to hear exactly that answer. No one on that station had ever heard a human tell alien royalty their technology was wrong and survive the conversation. So the silence that followed felt heavier than the gravity field humming under our boots. The princess did not look offended. If anything, the faint curve of her lips suggested curiosity, the kind engineers get when they hear someone challenge a design they thought was perfect. One of the tall guards stepped forward, his armor whispering as the joints moved, and he spoke rapidly in his own language, the translator in my ear turning the tone into something polite but clearly disapproving. The princess lifted her hand again, and the guard stopped instantly. She stepped closer to the battered mining exoframe beside me and studied the servo joint I had just tightened, watching the way the actuator aligned under pressure. Her golden eyes moved from the machine to my tools and finally back to the armor she wore, as if comparing two very different philosophies of engineering. Up close the suit was remarkable, layers of articulated plates connected by micro-servos and glowing energy filaments. Easily the most advanced piece of hardware that had ever walked into Bay 12. But the flaw was still obvious to anyone who had spent years fixing machines built by people who cared more about appearance than reliability. The neural response loop was fighting the mechanical timing of the joints. It was subtle, maybe a fraction of a second, but in a system like that a half-second might as well be a mile. The princess tilted her head slightly. "Explain," she said calmly. I wiped my hands on a rag and stood up, suddenly aware that about 30 alien soldiers were watching me like I had just volunteered to juggle plasma cells. "Your armor reacts before the joints are ready," I said, pointing toward the glowing control lattice along her spine. "The control system assumes the servos can keep up, but the mechanical delay means the suit is always correcting itself. That is why your movement looks smooth but feels wrong." A few of the technicians exchanged uneasy glances. The princess did something unexpected. She slowly lifted one arm, then rotated her shoulder in a careful circle. The plates shifted with a soft metallic whisper, and for a brief moment the correction lag showed itself exactly the way I described it. Her eyes brightened slightly. "You observed this from across the hangar," she said. "Yeah," I answered with a small shrug. "Machines talk if you know how to watch them." One of the technicians finally spoke, his voice defensive through the translator. He insisted that the armor had been designed by the finest engineers in the Empire and calibrated to royal standards. I did not argue. Instead, I picked up my torque wrench and gestured toward the suit's shoulder assembly. "Those engineers probably built something impressive," I said. "But impressive and practical are not always the same thing." The princess looked at me for another long moment. Then she did something that made every guard in the hangar stiffen. She unclasped the upper plate of her armor and let it slide open just enough to expose the servo cluster beneath. The glowing mechanisms inside hummed quietly, elegant and complicated, and just slightly out of sync with themselves. "Very well, Ethan Carter," she said, speaking my name as if she had already decided to remember it. "Show me what you would change." And in that moment, I realized the most powerful person in that hangar was not angry that a human mechanic had criticized her royal armor. She was interested. The moment the armor plate opened, the entire hangar seemed to lean forward with it, like every pair of eyes in Bay 12 suddenly remembered how to breathe again. I stepped closer, careful not to touch anything yet, studying the servo cluster that pulsed beneath the royal plating. The engineering was beautiful, no question about it. Micro actuators arranged in concentric rings, fiber control lines running through a glowing neural lattice, every component polished to the kind of precision you only see in machines that cost more than a small colony. But elegance does not always mean efficiency, and as the servos hummed quietly, I could hear the timing problem as clearly as if the machine had spoken out loud. The princess watched me without blinking. Her guards remained perfectly still, but I could feel their attention like the heat from a welding torch. "You are very quiet," she said after a moment. "Thinking," I replied. I crouched slightly so the hangar lights reflected across the actuator housing, then pointed toward a narrow stabilizer arm that connected the servo cluster to the shoulder frame. "There," I said. "That link is compensating for the delay instead of preventing it." One of the technicians stepped forward again, clearly struggling to remain respectful. Through the translator, his voice carried a mixture of pride and disbelief. He explained that the stabilizer system was a royal design standard, calibrated across thousands of units and tested under extreme conditions. I nodded slowly. "That is exactly the problem," I said. "You built something strong enough to survive anything, but the control loop still assumes perfect timing. The moment a delay appears, the stabilizer starts chasing the error instead of fixing the source." The princess lifted her arm again and flexed her fingers. The armor responded smoothly, but I could see the correction ripple through the joints like a wave moving through water. She noticed it now too. "If you are correct," she said calmly, "what would you change?" I reached down and picked up the small diagnostic scanner from my tool case, the kind of device most mechanics use to check cargo loaders and mining rigs. Compared to her armor, it looked like something bought at a roadside hardware store. Still, machines care about signals, not appearances. I passed the scanner slowly across the exposed servo cluster and watched the readout scroll across the cracked screen. The numbers confirmed what I already suspected. "Your system is predicting movement 2 milliseconds too early," I explained. "That does not sound like much, but when the suit amplifies your strength and speed, 2 milliseconds becomes a constant correction." The technicians exchanged another uneasy look. The princess did not. She simply studied the small scanner in my hand, then the servo assembly, then me. "And you can correct this?" she asked. I considered the question carefully. Fixing the problem was not complicated, but touching royal equipment that belonged to someone powerful enough to arrive in a 300-foot starship was a different matter entirely. Finally, I gave a small shrug. "Yes," I said, "but it means changing the control timing and realigning the stabilizer arm. Your engineers built the suit to look perfect. I would rebuild it to move properly." The hangar grew quiet again. The princess looked down at the open armor plate for a long moment, then back at me. Her expression did not show doubt or anger. It showed something much rarer in someone used to command. "Interest. Then begin," she said softly, as if she had already decided that whatever happened next would be worth watching. The moment she said begin, the entire hangar seemed to shift from curiosity to disbelief, as if no one present had ever imagined that a royal battle suit would be opened on a dusty repair floor beside a human mining rig. I set my tool case on the metal deck and flipped it open, revealing the same collection of practical equipment that had fixed cargo loaders, tractor servos, and more than a few stubborn reactor couplings across half the frontier. Compared to the technology inside the princess's armor, my tools looked almost primitive, but precision is not measured by price tags. It is measured by patience. I slid the diagnostic scanner across the servo cluster again and watched the signal curves ripple across the small screen. The delay appeared exactly where I expected, a narrow spike in the response loop that kept repeating every time the suit tried to match the princess's movement. "The control system is predicting motion too early," I said while adjusting the scanner's sensitivity. "Your engineers tried to solve that by reinforcing the stabilizer, but the stabilizer only hides the timing problem. It does not remove it." One of the technicians folded his arms and studied my equipment with clear skepticism. His armor glimmered with subtle light patterns that probably represented more processing power than the entire junk station. The princess noticed the tension but did not interrupt. Instead, she watched every motion of my hands as I removed the protective housing around the stabilizer link. The metal piece was barely 6 inches long, polished to mirror brightness, and mounted with a set of micro bolts no larger than grains of rice. Beautiful work. Completely unnecessary. I loosened the bolts carefully and lifted the link free while the technicians leaned closer to observe. The small component hummed softly as the armor redistributed its internal balance. "This piece compensates for a mistake the system should not be making in the first place," I explained. "If we adjust the neural timing to match the mechanical delay, the stabilizer will no longer need to correct anything." The princess tilted her head slightly. "You removed the solution to reveal the problem." "Exactly," I said. I reached into my case again and pulled out a thin calibration probe, the kind used to realign actuator timing on industrial exoframes. The probe connected to the armor's servo node with a quiet click that echoed across the hangar. For a moment, the entire royal guard seemed to hold their breath. The scanner display flickered as new data streamed across the cracked glass. Numbers shifted. The timing curve flattened. I adjusted the response threshold by a fraction and watched the spike disappear completely. The armor emitted a deeper, steadier hum, like an engine finally running in rhythm with itself. The princess slowly lifted her arm again. This time the movement flowed through the plates without the faint ripple I had seen before. No correction wave. No hesitation. Just motion that felt natural. Even from a few feet away, I could see the difference. The technicians looked at the scanner, then at the armor, then at each other as if the laws of engineering had quietly rearranged themselves in front of them. The princess lowered her arm and studied me with a thoughtful expression. "My engineers spent years refining this design," she said calmly. "You adjusted it in less than 10 minutes. I closed the servo housing and wiped my hands on the rag again. "That is the advantage of fixing broken machines every day," I replied. "You learn to listen when they complain." For a long moment, she said nothing, simply observing the armor as it responded perfectly to each small movement. Then her golden eyes returned to me, brighter now with a curiosity that had clearly grown stronger. "Ethan Carter," she said quietly, "I believe this suit is not the only thing here that deserves closer study." The armor responded to the princess now the way a well-tuned engine responds to a skilled driver, smooth and immediate, every movement flowing without the faint mechanical hesitation that had been there before, and the quiet hum inside the suit had settled into a steady rhythm that even the old station floor seemed to notice. I packed the calibration probe back into my tool case while the technicians circled slowly, studying the armor as if it had become a different machine in the last few minutes. One of them ran a scanner across the shoulder assembly and stared at the readout longer than necessary. The numbers were clearly telling him the same thing my old handheld device had already confirmed. The correction loop was gone. The stabilizer no longer chased errors because the errors had stopped appearing in the first place. The princess rotated her arm once more, then flexed her fingers with quiet precision, watching the plates glide into place with perfect timing. She lowered her hand slowly and looked around the hangar, noticing the stunned silence of her own engineers. "It appears," she said calmly, "that our human mechanic has solved a problem that none of you believed existed." No one argued. Engineers rarely do when a machine proves the point for them. I snapped my tool case shut and leaned back against the mining rig I had been fixing earlier, the familiar smell of oil and warm metal drifting through the bay again, as if the entire moment had simply been another strange repair job on a frontier station. "The suit was already impressive," I said with a small shrug. "It just needed to stop trying so hard to correct itself." The princess studied me carefully, her golden eyes reflecting the overhead lights like polished glass. "You say this as though the solution was obvious." "Not obvious," I answered. "Just easier to see when you spend most of your life fixing machines that were designed by committees." A quiet ripple of laughter moved through a few of the station workers watching from the far side of the hangar. The royal technicians did not laugh, but their expressions had changed from doubt to thoughtful calculation. The princess took a slow step away from the open armor panel and walked around the mining rig beside me, observing the half-repaired actuator I had been working on before her arrival. The machine was old, scratched, and patched together from parts that had clearly come from 3 different manufacturers, but the alignment I had just finished adjusting allowed the joint to move with surprising smoothness. She rested her hand lightly on the metal frame and watched the servo cycle once under its own weight. "You repair war armor and mining equipment with the same tools," she said. "Machines are machines," I replied. "They only care whether someone understands what they are trying to do." She looked back toward her starship, the long silver hull visible through the open hangar doors like a reflection of moonlight floating in space. Then her gaze returned to me, thoughtful in a way that suggested her mind was already moving several steps ahead of everyone else in the room. "Ethan Carter," she said quietly. "How long have you worked on this station?" I thought about it for a moment. "Almost 5 years. And in that time," she continued, "has anyone ever asked you to repair something that represented the power of an entire empire?" I smiled faintly and shook my head. "No," I said. "Usually it is just broken cargo loaders and stubborn airlock motors." She nodded slowly, as if confirming something she had suspected from the beginning. The hangar lights reflected across her armor as the newly balanced servos moved perfectly with each step. "Then perhaps," she said with calm certainty, "it is time you worked on something larger than cargo loaders." And the way she said it made the entire station feel suddenly very small. The princess's words lingered in the air long after she finished speaking, the quiet confidence in her voice somehow louder than the hum of the station's gravity field. Around us the hangar slowly began to breathe again. Workers who had frozen in place during the repair returned to their tasks, though most of them kept glancing back toward the royal visitors as if they expected the entire moment to reverse itself. I rested one hand on the edge of the mining rig and looked out through the open bay doors where the princess's starship hovered like a polished monument 200 feet away, its surface reflecting the pale light of the desert moon below. "Something larger usually means something more complicated," I said after a moment. "Complicated machines tend to break in interesting ways." The princess regarded me with that same thoughtful calm she had carried since the moment she stepped into the hangar. "And you enjoy solving interesting problems." It was not really a question. I considered the half-repaired exo-frame beside me, the worn metal plates and the patched actuator that had probably survived 10 different owners before reaching this station. Machines like that always had stories hidden in their scratches. "I enjoy understanding why something does not work," I replied. "Once you understand that part, fixing it is usually the easy step." One of the royal technicians approached cautiously, holding a sleek diagnostic tablet that projected a small field of holographic data. He glanced from the display to the princess's armor, and then to me, clearly still processing the fact that the correction loop had vanished. The servo response is stable, he reported carefully. The timing variance is below 1 microsecond. The princess nodded slightly, but kept her attention on me. My engineers designed that armor to represent the strength of our empire, she said. You improved it with a tool that appears to be older than your station. I smiled faintly and tapped the small scanner still clipped to my belt. Good tools are like good ideas. They do not need to look impressive to work well. She stepped closer to the mining rig again, studying the exposed actuator I had been repairing before her arrival. And yet you have remained here for 5 years, fixing machines that travel no farther than the cargo docks. I shrugged. Someone has to keep them running. For a moment, she simply observed the busy hangar, the cargo lifts sliding along rails, the distant clatter of a loader moving crates across the floor, the ordinary rhythm of a place built on practical work instead of royal ceremony. Then she turned back toward her ship, the tall vessel glimmering against the star-filled sky beyond the bay doors. My people have machines that cross entire star systems, she said quietly. Warships, exploration vessels, orbital gates. Every one of them depends on engineers who believe they understand every flaw. She paused, letting the statement settle before finishing. But today a mechanic from a frontier junk station noticed something they did not. I folded my arms and studied the smooth movement of her armor again. The suit now responded to her like a natural extension of her body, every step balanced and precise. Sometimes the easiest way to see a problem, I said, is to stand far enough away from the people who designed it. The princess's golden eyes brightened slightly, as if that answer confirmed something she had been measuring from the beginning. Then perhaps, she said, glancing once more toward the immense ship outside the hangar, you should stand a little closer to the machines that shape our future. And judging by the quiet certainty in her voice, she had already decided exactly where that closer place would be. The hangar slowly returned to its ordinary rhythm, but the feeling in the air had changed in a way that even the old station walls seemed to notice. Cargo lifts rolled past on their rails, workers resumed welding seams on damaged hull plates, and somewhere above us a docking alarm chimed softly as another freighter requested clearance. Yet every few seconds someone glanced toward the tall blue-skinned visitor standing beside the half-repaired mining rig and the human mechanic who had just altered the calibration of a royal battle suit. The princess remained quiet for a long moment, studying the environment around her as if she were observing a new ecosystem instead of a dusty repair bay floating 200 miles above a desert moon. The armor moved with perfect balance now, the plates aligning with her steps so smoothly that the faint metallic whisper had almost disappeared entirely. I noticed the difference immediately. Machines always reveal their mood through sound, and this one had finally stopped complaining. She turned slightly and looked toward the wide hangar doors where her starship hovered beyond the docking field. Up close, the vessel was enormous, easily 300 feet from bow to stern, its curved hull reflecting the faint starlight like a piece of polished stone floating in darkness. I had repaired cargo ships half that size before, but this craft was something else entirely. It carried the quiet confidence of a machine designed by people who expected it to outlive the generation that built it. The princess followed my gaze and then spoke without looking away from the ship. That vessel is called the Vathera Dawn, she said. It has crossed more than 100 star systems in the service of my house. I let out a low whistle. That sounds like a lot of maintenance hours. She turned her head slightly, and the hint of amusement returned to her expression. You see a royal flagship, and your first thought is maintenance. Every machine needs it, I replied. Even the impressive ones. Behind her, one of the technicians adjusted the diagnostic tablet again, clearly fascinated by the new timing curve still running across the display. The numbers remained perfectly stable. The princess watched the technician for a moment and then returned her attention to me. My engineers study equations and simulations for years before they alter a design, she said thoughtfully. You listened to a sound and corrected the problem in minutes. I leaned back against the mining rig and folded my arms. Engineers sometimes forget that machines exist in the real world, I said. Out here we do not have the luxury of perfect conditions. If something breaks, we fix it with whatever tools we have. She took a slow step closer, examining the scratched metal casing of my old tool case resting on the deck. The surface carried the marks of years of work, tiny dents and burn lines that recorded more stories than I could remember. She reached out and lightly tapped the lid with one long blue finger. "You have spent 5 years repairing broken equipment in a forgotten corner of space," she said quietly. "Yet today you improved technology that represents the pride of an empire." I shrugged slightly. Sometimes the universe hides useful mechanics in strange places. The princess smiled at that, a calm and thoughtful expression that suggested the idea had already settled comfortably in her mind. She glanced once more toward the distant silhouette of her starship and then back to the busy hangar floor. The workers, the tools, the endless rhythm of repair and adjustment. Finally, her gaze returned to me with a clarity that felt like the moment before a machine powers on for the first time. "Ethan Carter," she said, "tell me something honestly." I raised an eyebrow. "Sure." She folded her hands behind her back, the perfectly balanced armor moving like a second skin. "If you had the chance to repair something far more complicated than cargo loaders or mining rigs," she asked calmly, "would you take it?" I glanced once more toward the massive ship outside the hangar doors, and then back at the princess who had just asked the question, as if the answer might quietly change both of our futures. "That depends," I said slowly, "on how broken it is." The princess did not answer immediately, which told me the question had never really been about how broken something was. Instead, she studied my face the way someone studies a complex instrument before deciding whether to trust it. Around us, the hangar carried on with its usual rhythm, metal carts rolling across the deck, welding torches hissing somewhere near the far wall, the distant vibration of a cargo shuttle locking into Dock 3. Ordinary sounds. Familiar sounds. The kind that had filled my days for nearly 5 years. Finally, she turned her head slightly toward the open hangar doors where the massive outline of the Vathera Dawn floated against the stars like a quiet mountain made of silver. "The machine I am speaking about," she said calmly, "is far more complicated than a starship." I tilted my head. "That narrows it down less than you might think." A faint smile touched the corner of her lips. "It is not a single machine," she continued. "It is a network of systems that span entire fleets. Navigation arrays, energy relays, command interfaces, tactical coordination platforms. My people have refined these systems for generations." She paused, letting her words settle over the quiet hum of the hangar. "Yet lately they have begun to behave inefficiently." I raised an eyebrow. "Inefficient how?" One of the technicians stepped forward with the diagnostic tablet again, projecting a cluster of holographic diagrams into the air. Lines of light represented ship formations, communication relays, and energy routing patterns stretching across what looked like several star systems. Even without knowing the details, I could see the problem immediately. The network was constantly adjusting itself, small corrections chasing other corrections, the same pattern I had just removed from her armor. I leaned closer to the display and pointed toward a looping signal path. "Your system keeps correcting predictions that are slightly off," I said slowly. "Every time it compensates, it creates a new delay somewhere else." The technician stared at the projection and then at me, clearly surprised that someone looking at the diagram for the first time had reached the same conclusion his own instruments had probably been reporting for months. The princess watched the exchange with quiet satisfaction. "You recognize the pattern quickly," she said. "It is the same mistake your engineers made with the armor," I replied. "You built a system that tries to be perfect before it moves. Real machines work better when they adapt after they move." She studied the holographic display again, her golden eyes reflecting the shifting light. "My advisors have spent years attempting to solve this," she said thoughtfully. "Entire laboratories have examined these systems." I folded my arms and glanced toward the enormous starship outside the hangar. "And none of them thought to ask a mechanic from a junk station." "No," she admitted calmly. "They did not." The projection slowly faded as the technician lowered the tablet, but the silence that followed felt heavier than the glowing diagrams had been. The princess stepped closer until she stood beside my old tool case again, the royal armor moving with flawless balance after the adjustment I had made. For a moment, she simply looked at the battered metal lid, the scratches and burn marks left by years of repairs. Then she lifted her gaze back to me. "Ethan Carter," she said, her voice steady and certain. I believe the systems that guide my fleet suffer from the same flaw you corrected here today. I considered the thought for a moment, and then glanced once more at the distant starship waiting beyond the hangar doors. If that is true, I said slowly, then your empire has been trying to fix the symptoms instead of the cause. The princess nodded once. Exactly. I gave a small thoughtful hum and tapped the edge of my tool case. Well, I said, that kind of problem usually means taking the entire system apart and rebuilding the timing from the ground up. She met my eyes with calm certainty. That, she replied, is precisely why I came here. For a moment I did not answer because the meaning of her words took a few seconds to settle in properly. Around us the hangar continued its steady rhythm of work, but the quiet certainty in the princess's voice made everything else feel distant, like background noise behind an important conversation. I glanced again toward the massive silhouette of the Vathera Dawn floating beyond the hangar doors, its smooth hull reflecting starlight like a calm ocean surface. A ship like that did not travel 200 miles to visit a forgotten junk station by accident. I folded my arms and leaned lightly against the mining rig, the familiar smell of oil and warm metal grounding my thoughts. You crossed a lot of space just to ask a mechanic about a systems problem, I said slowly. The princess did not deny it. Instead, she walked a few steps across the hangar floor, her armor moving with quiet precision now that its timing had been corrected. The plates shifted in perfect harmony with each movement, almost silent except for the soft hum of balanced servos. She paused beside the open hangar doors and looked out at the starfield, the distant desert moon glowing faintly below the station like a pale coin. My advisors suggested visiting research centers, she said calmly. They recommended universities, laboratories, even military design facilities. She turned her head slightly, so the light caught the gold in her eyes. But none of them could explain why our systems behave the way they do. I followed her gaze out toward the enormous ship waiting patiently in the docking field. So you came looking for someone who fixes problems instead of studying them. She nodded once. Exactly. Behind us, the technician with the diagnostic tablet was still examining the projection data, clearly unsettled by how easily the pattern had been recognized. Engineers often prefer complicated answers, but machines rarely care about pride. I rubbed my chin thoughtfully and considered the network diagram she had shown earlier. If your fleets are built around the same predictive timing loop as your armor, the entire system would keep correcting itself, I said slowly. Every adjustment creates another delay somewhere else. The princess listened carefully, which means the more the network tries to stabilize itself, the less stable it becomes, she said. Yes, I replied. It is like trying to steer a truck by guessing where the road will be instead of looking where it actually is. She seemed to appreciate the comparison. For a moment neither of us spoke, and the silence carried the quiet weight of a decision approaching from somewhere just out of sight. Finally, she stepped away from the hangar doors and returned to where my battered tool case rested on the deck. Her gaze lingered on the scratches across its surface before lifting back to meet mine. Ethan Carter, she said, if you examine the control systems aboard the Vathera Dawn, could you confirm your theory? I let out a small breath through my nose and glanced again toward the enormous ship. The idea of stepping aboard something like that felt a little like being asked to repair the engine of a mountain. I could probably tell you what is wrong, I admitted. Fixing it might take longer. The princess did not seem concerned. In fact, the faint smile that returned to her expression suggested that this was exactly the answer she had hoped to hear. Time is not the problem, she said. Understanding is. I looked down at my tool case for a moment, and then back at the towering ship waiting outside the station. Machines always reveal their secrets eventually, but some of them take you on a long journey before they do. All right, I said at last. I can take a look. The princess nodded once, calm and certain, as if the outcome of this conversation had been obvious from the moment she walked into the hangar. The decision settled into the air between us with surprising simplicity, like a machine finally reaching the right operating speed after struggling through a dozen small adjustments. The princess did not celebrate or react dramatically. She simply nodded once, as if a step in a long-planned sequence had just clicked into place. Around us the hangar continued its steady rhythm, cargo carts humming along their rails and workers returning to their welding torches, but a quiet circle of attention had formed around the conversation. People might not have understood the details of what had just been discussed, yet they could feel the weight of the moment. I pushed myself away from the mining rig and walked toward the open hangar doors, stopping a few feet from the edge where the docking field began. The Vathera Dawn hovered there like a patient giant, its curved hull stretching nearly 300 feet from bow to stern, every surface smooth and reflective under the distant starlight. Up close it was even larger than I had first guessed. A ship like that carried thousands of interconnected systems, propulsion drives, navigation arrays, environmental networks, communication relays, and probably more layers of command architecture than most people ever realized. I let out a slow breath. "That is a big machine," I said quietly. The princess joined me at the edge of the hangar, the newly balanced armor moving in silent harmony with each step. "It is only one ship," she replied, "but it represents the command core of an entire fleet." I nodded slowly. "Which means if the control network is built the same way as your armor used to be, every correction your fleet makes is probably creating another problem somewhere else." She watched the distant ship for a moment, clearly imagining the invisible flow of signals and commands moving through its systems. "Our analysts believe the same thing," she said, "but they cannot agree on where the error begins." I smiled faintly. "That usually means the mistake is somewhere very simple." Behind us the technician approached again, holding the diagnostic tablet carefully, as if it had suddenly become a very important object. He projected the network diagram into the air once more, the glowing structure of fleet coordination nodes stretching outward like a web of starlight. I stepped closer and studied the pattern. Even without touching the system, I could almost hear the problem the way I had heard the misaligned servo in her armor earlier. Too many predictions. Too many corrections chasing each other around the network. "You built a system that tries to anticipate everything," I said slowly. "That works in theory. In practice it makes the network nervous." The princess glanced at me with quiet interest. "Nervous? Machines get nervous too," I explained. "If they are constantly guessing what will happen next instead of reacting to what actually happens, they start overcorrecting." The technician lowered the projection, clearly absorbing the idea with the same reluctant fascination the armor technicians had shown earlier. The princess looked once more toward the Vathera Dawn, then back to me. "If you step aboard that vessel," she said calmly, "you will have access to the entire command architecture of my fleet." I considered the statement carefully. 5 years earlier, I had arrived on this station with a small bag of tools and the intention of staying just long enough to earn enough credits to move on. Instead, I had ended up repairing cargo loaders and mining rigs while the rest of the galaxy moved quietly around me. Now a starship the size of a city was waiting outside the hangar doors. I glanced down at my battered tool case resting beside the mining rig. Then I looked back up at the princess. "All right," I said at last. "Let us see what your fleet is trying so hard to fix." The faint smile that appeared on her face suggested that this was exactly the moment she had been waiting for since the Vathera Dawn first changed course toward a forgotten junk station floating above a nameless moon. The walk from the hangar floor to the waiting ship was shorter than I expected, but it felt like crossing a line between two completely different worlds. A narrow boarding bridge extended from the station toward the hull of the Vathera Dawn, its surface lit by thin lines of soft white light that pulsed gently beneath our feet. I carried my battered tool case in one hand, the metal handle worn smooth from years of use, while the princess walked beside me with the steady confidence of someone who had crossed this bridge many times before. Behind us the sounds of the junk station slowly faded, replaced by a quieter atmosphere where every movement seemed carefully controlled. As we reached the airlock, the outer doors parted with a smooth hydraulic whisper, and warm interior light spilled across the bridge. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the absence of sound, but the absence of struggle. Every machine inside the ship seemed to operate with calm efficiency. The corridor beyond the airlock stretched nearly 100 feet, lined with curved walls of silver alloy that reflected the light in soft patterns. Crew members moved along the passage with quiet purpose, their uniforms marked with symbols I did not recognize, but their expressions curious as they noticed the unfamiliar human mechanics stepping aboard their flagship. The princess did not slow her pace. "Welcome to the Vathera Dawn," she said calmly as we entered the corridor. I glanced around, studying the details the way I always did when encountering a new machine. The lighting panels were evenly spaced, the air circulation vents positioned at regular intervals, and beneath the polished floor, I could feel the faint vibration of a massive propulsion system idling somewhere deep within the ship's structure. It reminded me of standing inside the engine housing of a cargo freighter, except this vessel carried the quiet power of something far more advanced. Your engineers know how to build a beautiful machine, I said. They will be pleased to hear that, the princess replied. We continued down the corridor until it opened into a circular chamber nearly 60 feet across. At the center of the room, a large holographic display hovered in the air, projecting layers of navigation data, fleet positions, and communication signals that flowed across the space like a living map of the stars. Several officers stood nearby, examining the information with focused attention. When they noticed the princess entering the room, they stepped aside respectfully. Her armor moved with flawless balance as she approached the display. This is the command interface for our fleet coordination network, she explained. Every ship in the Vathra fleet exchanges data through this system. I set my tool case down beside the control platform and studied the projection carefully. Thousands of signals moved through the display, each representing a vessel, a command relay, or a navigation correction being transmitted across vast distances. At first glance, the system looked perfectly organized, but after a few seconds I began to notice the same pattern I had seen earlier in the technician's tablet. Small corrections chasing other corrections, signals adjusting themselves again and again in an endless loop of prediction. I leaned closer to the display, following one signal path as it branched into 3 others, and then curved back toward the central node. There it is, I said quietly. The princess turned slightly. You see the flaw? I nodded once, already recognizing the familiar rhythm of a machine trying too hard to be perfect. Yes, I replied. Your fleet is making the same mistake your armor was making. The officers in the room exchanged puzzled glances while the princess watched me with calm focus. I straightened slowly and looked across the enormous holographic network stretching through the chamber. And if I am right, I added, the entire system has been correcting the wrong problem for years. The officers around the command chamber grew noticeably quieter after that statement, the kind of silence that happens when experienced engineers suddenly realize someone might be describing a flaw they have been standing inside for years without seeing it. The holographic network continued to pulse above the central platform, star systems blinking in slow rhythm, while lines of light carried commands across distances measured in light years. I stepped closer to the projection and followed one signal path again, watching the same pattern repeat itself across different fleet groups. A correction signal would leave the command node, adjust a formation vector, and then another node would immediately adjust the adjustment. The loop never stopped. Your fleet network is predicting where every ship should be before the ship actually moves, I said slowly. That sounds efficient on paper, but the moment real conditions change, the system starts correcting its own predictions. One of the officers finally spoke. His voice was controlled but clearly skeptical. Our predictive command architecture has been refined for generations. It allows our fleets to maneuver with unmatched coordination. I nodded. I believe that. It probably worked perfectly when the network was smaller. I pointed toward a cluster of signals near the edge of the projection where multiple fleets intersected through long-range communication relays. But once the network grew large enough, every prediction started interacting with another prediction. The officer frowned slightly as he studied the same section. The princess remained silent beside me, allowing the explanation to unfold naturally. Your system is not responding to real movement anymore, I continued. It is responding to the predictions made by the other nodes. I reached down and opened my tool case, pulling out the same small diagnostic scanner I had used earlier in the hangar. Compared to the massive command platform, it looked almost ridiculous, but signal patterns are still signals no matter how big the machine becomes. I connected the scanner to a nearby auxiliary port beneath the command console. The officers exchanged uncertain looks, but the princess gave a slight nod allowing it. The scanner screen flickered as streams of data passed through the simple interface. A moment later, the familiar pattern appeared again, a repeating delay curve almost identical to the one that had been hidden inside the armor servo earlier that day. I angled the small screen so the officers could see it. There, I said. Every time the network predicts a maneuver, it introduces a tiny timing offset. Then another node compensates for that offset, which creates another delay somewhere else. One of the officers leaned closer to the display, his expression shifting from doubt to reluctant interest. "You are suggesting the fleet is chasing its own commands." "Exactly," I replied. "Your system is so focused on being ahead of events that it never reacts to the actual event itself." The princess stepped forward then, studying the scanner's simple display beside the enormous holographic network floating above us. The contrast between the two systems could not have been clearer. One was vast and elegant. The other was a scratched handheld device built for field repairs. Yet both were now showing the same truth. "If your observation is correct," she said calmly, "the solution would require altering the command timing across the entire fleet." I closed the scanner and slid it back into my tool case. "Not just altering it," I replied. "You would need to remove the predictive loop completely and rebuild the system so the network responds to real movement instead of guessing it." The officers exchanged glances again. That kind of change would affect every ship under their command. The princess looked up at the glowing network, the light of 100-star systems reflecting in her golden eyes. "And if we did that," she asked quietly, "the fleet would stabilize." I nodded once. "Yes," I said. "Your empire does not have a coordination problem. It has a timing problem." And for the first time since entering the chamber, the officers began to look at the holographic network not with pride, but with the cautious curiosity of engineers who had just discovered their most trusted machine might be built around a single small mistake. The command chamber remained silent after my explanation, but it was no longer the uncertain silence of confusion. It was the quiet concentration of people who had just been handed a new way to look at something they believed they already understood. The holographic network above us continued its steady pulse of light, fleets moving across projected starfields while command signals threaded between them like rivers of data. Only now the pattern looked different. Once you notice a flaw in a machine, it becomes impossible to ignore. The princess studied the network for a long moment, her golden eyes following the loops of correction signals moving through the system. Finally, she turned slightly toward the officers standing around the platform. "If we remove the predictive correction layer," she said calmly, "the network will respond only to real fleet movement." One of the senior officers nodded slowly. "Yes, Your Highness," he said, still watching the display. "But the change would require recalibrating every command node in the fleet." I rested one hand on the edge of the console and shrugged lightly. "Machines do not care how long something has been done the wrong way," I said. "They only care when someone finally fixes it." A few quiet smiles appeared among the officers. Engineers always appreciate that kind of honesty once the initial shock wears off. The princess turned back toward the holographic projection and raised one hand slightly. The command interface responded instantly, isolating the predictive layer within the system architecture. Thousands of thin data streams shifted position, revealing the complex loop of timing corrections hidden beneath the network. For a moment, the room watched the structure in silence. Then she looked at me again. "Ethan Carter," she said, "would you implement the correction?" I opened my tool case again and removed the small scanner, setting it beside the command console, as if I were preparing to adjust another stubborn mining actuator. "Sure," I said, "but it will take a few minutes to make the system stop guessing." The officer stepped back as I accessed the command interface. The system was far more advanced than anything I had worked with before, but the logic behind it was still familiar. A machine trying to predict the future instead of reacting to the present. I traced the timing loop through the architecture and slowly removed the predictive compensation nodes one by one, letting the command network settle into a simpler rhythm. The holographic display shifted almost immediately. The endless chains of correction signals faded, replaced by clean communication lines that moved directly between fleet nodes without chasing their own predictions. The entire network seemed to relax, like an engine finally running at the right speed after a long period of strain. I stepped back from the console and closed my toolcase again. "There," I said. "Your fleet is now responding to real movement instead of imaginary delays." The officers examined the display carefully. One of them ran a verification scan through the command interface and then looked up with clear amazement. "The signal variance has dropped to near zero," he reported. The princess studied the network a moment longer before nodding once. The system now flowed smoothly across the star map, fleets adjusting naturally without the constant ripple of correction loops. She turned toward me, the balanced armor reflecting the quiet light of the chamber. You corrected a flaw that has affected our fleets for years, she said calmly. I shrugged again. It was the same problem as the armor, I replied. Just a bigger machine. For a moment she said nothing, simply observing the steady glow of the network that now guided her empire's ships. Then she looked back at me with the faint, thoughtful smile I had seen in the hangar earlier. According to the ancient traditions of my house, she said slowly, the one who repairs the armor of a royal heir and restores the command strength of their fleet becomes bound to that house. I raised an eyebrow slightly. Bound how? The princess's golden eyes held mine with calm certainty. As consort, she answered. And for the first time since stepping aboard the Vaethra Dawn, I realized that fixing a machine had just changed the course of my entire life.